My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 67 years old, and 3 months ago, on the first Thanksgiving after burying my wife, I watched my own son slide something into my coffee while pretending to ask his wife for more cranberry sauce. He thought grief had made me weak, thought loneliness had made me blind. But grief sharpens certain instincts, especially when the people smiling across the dinner table are waiting for you to die. I remember the exact sound the packet made. Soft, quick, paper against ceramic. Most men would have missed it beneath the noise of forks and family conversation. I didn't, because for weeks, I had already suspected something was wrong inside my house. And the terrible part wasn't the betrayal. It was realizing my son no longer looked at me like a father. He looked at me like an obstacle standing between him and something he believed already belonged to him. Before I tell you what happened after I switched the cups, tell me something in the comments. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone you loved and realized they were hiding something dangerous from you? Because once you see that look, you never unsee it again. My wife Margaret died 11 months before Thanksgiving. Pancreatic cancer. Fast. Brutal. By the time doctors caught it, the disease had already spread like fire through dry grass. 41 years together disappeared in less than 7 months. People tell you grief gets easier with time. Those people are liars. Grief doesn't get easier. It just becomes quieter, like a wound that stops bleeding but never fully closes. After Margaret died, the house became unbearable after sunset. Every room still carried pieces of her. Her reading glasses beside the couch. Her half-finished crossword puzzles. The lavender perfume lingering faintly inside our bedroom closet. Some nights I walked through the hallway just to hear the floorboards creak, because it reminded me of her footsteps. I had spent my entire adult life building Bennett electrical systems from a single repair garage into one of the largest commercial contractors in western Pennsylvania. But none of that mattered once Margaret was gone. The business had never been my real life. She was. My son Daniel became unusually attentive after the funeral. Too attentive. Daily phone calls. Weekend visits. Long talks over whiskey he suddenly insisted we share. At first, I thought grief had brought us closer. That losing his mother reminded him family mattered. Looking back now, I understand something horrifying. Predators don't always arrive growling. Sometimes they arrive carrying groceries and asking how you've been sleeping. Daniel was 38, smart, charming, polished in the way ambitious men often are. He worked in private wealth management outside Pittsburgh and loved presenting himself as a financial strategist to wealthy retirees. Margaret used to say he inherited my discipline and her ability to read people. Maybe that's why he became so dangerous, because he understood exactly how trust works and exactly how to weaponize it. The first strained conversation happened 6 weeks after Margaret's funeral. We were sitting on my back porch while rain rolled through the yard in slow gray sheets. Daniel leaned back in his chair and asked if I'd updated my estate plan since Mom passed. The question itself wasn't unusual. The timing was. There are moments when a sentence reveals more than words should. This was one of them. I remember staring at him while steam rose from my coffee mug. He avoided eye contact for just half a second before continuing. Dad, I've been thinking, he said carefully, managing everything alone at your age, that's a lot of pressure. At your age. Not after everything you've been through. Not while grieving. At your age. That was the first crack in the mask. I told him my attorneys and financial advisors already handled everything. He nodded too quickly, smiled too easily, then spent 20 minutes explaining why traditional advisors were outdated and how he could protect my assets better than anyone else. The entire conversation sounded rehearsed, not emotional, strategic, like he'd practiced it beforehand. 2 days later, his wife Vanessa called me. Vanessa had always been difficult to read. Beautiful, controlled, the type of woman who smiled without warmth. Margaret once described her as a woman constantly calculating the room. At the time, I thought that sounded harsh. Now I think Margaret saw a danger long before I did. Vanessa told me she worried about me living alone. Said Daniel only wanted to help because he loved me. Then she mentioned my money 3 separate times in under 4 minutes. That's when my instinct started screaming. You don't spend 40 years negotiating contracts without learning how greed sounds when it disguises itself as concern. The following Monday, I contacted my attorney, Rebecca Sloan, 54 years old, ruthless in court, incapable of sugarcoating reality. She represented my company for nearly 15 years and once saved me from signing a disastrous acquisition deal because, in her words, desperate people leak dishonesty through tiny behavioral cracks. When I explained my concerns about Daniel, she listened silently the entire time. Finally, she asked one question. Do you believe your son is capable of hurting you financially? I opened my mouth to say no, but the word never came out. Instead, I said, I don't know anymore. Rebecca hired a private investigative firm the next morning. What they found shattered something inside me forever. Daniel owed nearly $1.8 million across failed investment partnerships, personal loans, gambling debt, and leverage accounts tied to clients who were beginning to threaten lawsuits. Vanessa co-signed most of it. Worse, investigators discovered Daniel had recently consulted with a neurologist known for controversial cognitive evaluations involving elderly patients. 2 former clients had accused him privately of exaggerating dementia diagnoses to help family members secure conservatorship control. I understood immediately. They weren't trying to help me. They were building a legal case to declare me mentally incompetent. Once declared incapable of managing my finances, Daniel could gain authority over my estate, trust accounts, property holdings, everything Margaret and I spent 40 years building together. I remember sitting alone in Rebecca's office after hearing the report. There's a specific kind of pain that comes from realizing someone you raised from infancy has been studying your weaknesses like an enemy preparing for war. That pain doesn't feel sharp. It feels hollow, like part of your chest suddenly collapses inward. Rebecca asked what I wanted to do. I looked out the window for a long time before answering. Build the trap first, I said quietly. Then let him walk into it himself. And that's exactly what we did. For the next 2 months, I pretended to decline mentally. I repeated stories, forgot appointments, called Daniel pretending confused about bank statements I fully understood. Sometimes I deliberately lose track of conversations midway through dinner just to watch his reactions. Every single time, I caught the same flicker in his eyes. Excitement. That was the worst part. Not concern. Not sadness. Hope. By October, Daniel had stopped hiding it entirely. He began bringing paperwork during visits. Power of attorney drafts. Temporary assistance, authorizations, financial restructuring forms. Vanessa became strangely affectionate, constantly touching my shoulder and speaking slowly to me like I was already deteriorating. Meanwhile, cameras recorded everything, every conversation, every document, every lie. Then, 3 days before Thanksgiving, Rebecca called me at 6:40 in the morning. They're moving sooner than expected, she said. We intercepted communication between Daniel and the neurologist. They're planning emergency incapacity filings before Christmas. How desperate is he? I asked. There was a pause. Desperate people do dangerous things, Harold. I didn't fully understand what she meant until Thanksgiving afternoon. The entire family gathered at my house. Daniel, Vanessa, my younger sister Claire, and her husband Michael. Even my 2 granddaughters came running through the hallway laughing, completely unaware their parents were sitting at the dining table planning to steal their grandfather's life piece by piece. Dinner felt strangely normal. That's what evil does sometimes. It hides itself inside ordinary moments. Vanessa complimented the turkey. Daniel poured wine for everyone. Football played softly in the living room. And then, after dessert, I asked Daniel to help me carry coffee into the dining room. The moment we entered the kitchen, I heard it, that tiny sound. Paper opening behind me, then something falling into ceramic. I never turned around immediately. I let him think I noticed nothing, because predators become careless the second they believe they've already won. When I finally faced him, he was smiling calmly beside the counter, but his right hand was shaking. And sitting near the edge of the tray was my coffee cup. 5 days after Thanksgiving, my son returned to my house carrying flowers and a lie. The flowers were white lilies. Eleanor hated lilies. Said they smelled like funeral homes and hospitals, like endings pretending to be beautiful. Ryan knew that. He still carried them in any way. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was that he looked exhausted, not grieving, cornered. There's a difference. A grieving man looks inward. A cornered man keeps checking the exits. Dad, he said carefully, setting the flowers on the kitchen counter. How are you holding up? I stood at the sink rinsing a coffee mug that had already been clean when I picked it up 10 minutes earlier. Since Margaret died, I had developed a habit of washing things twice. It gave my hands something to do while my mind tried not to remember the sound of her breathing during the final week. I'm alive, I answered. Ryan forced a small laugh. That's something. No, it wasn't. Not after 41 years with the same woman. Survival is not the same thing as living. People only say that because they are terrified of silence. My name is Harold Bennett. I am 67 years old, and until last Thanksgiving, I believed betrayal always arrived loudly. I thought it came with shouting, slammed doors, lawyers, police lights, or another person's lipstick on a collar. I was wrong. Real betrayal comes quietly. It pours your coffee. It asks about your health. It calls you dad. Ryan watched me carefully while I dried the mug. He had Margaret's eyes but none of her softness. That realization had been haunting me lately. I've been worried about you, he said. You've barely answered my calls. I've been sleeping. At 3 in the afternoon? Grief doesn't wear a wristwatch. That landed harder than he expected. I saw a guilt flicker across his face, but only for a second. Then the mask returned. Listen, he said, sitting at the table. Emily thinks maybe you shouldn't be alone right now. Emily, my daughter-in-law, 38 years old, sharp enough to cut glass and ambitious enough to bleed you with the pieces. She worked in pharmaceutical sales and treated conversations like negotiations. Margaret once told me, quietly while folding laundry, that woman never enters a room unless she wants something from it. I should have listened more carefully when Margaret spoke. I'm fine alone, I said. Dad, you forgot to turn off the stove twice last month. Once. You wandered out of the grocery store and left your wallet. I was distracted. You called me at midnight because you thought someone was in the garage. I turned toward him slowly. There was someone in the garage. He froze. Barely, but enough. Tiny things tell the truth. A twitch around the eyes. A pause before breathing. Fear has fingerprints if you know where to look. What do you mean? He asked carefully. Motion sensor went off. I watched him while I spoke. By the time I got down there, whoever it was had already left. Ryan leaned back in his chair too, casually. Probably just an animal. Maybe. He nodded too fast. Yeah, probably. Then came silence. Heavy silence. The kind families create when love has been replaced by strategy. Finally, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. I knew before he even opened it what this visit was truly about. Money always changes the temperature in a room. Dad, he began gently. Emily and I talked, and we think it's time to make things easier for you. He slid the folder across the table. Power of attorney paperwork. Temporary financial oversight authorization. Estate restructuring recommendations. Every page designed to sound helpful while quietly removing control from my hands. I stared at the papers without touching them. You think I'm losing my mind, I said. No, too fast again. Of course not. Then why does this paperwork say I can no longer independently manage major financial decisions? It's precautionary. Against what? Against mistakes. There it was. Not concern. Not love. Positioning. The first move in a long game. I looked down at the signatures waiting at the bottom of the pages, and suddenly remembered something Margaret once said after Ryan lost his first baseball championship at 14. He had shaken the winning coach's hand, while smiling for photographs. Then he went into the parking lot, and kicked a dent into the other team's bus. Margaret watched from the car window, beside me. That boy doesn't handle losing well, she whispered. At the time, I laughed. God forgive me, I laughed. I'll think about it, I told him. Relief flashed across his face, because weak men mistake delay for surrender. That's all we're asking. He stood and walked toward the living room. His eyes drifted to Margaret's old piano near the fireplace. Dust had started gathering on the keys because nobody touched it anymore. "I still can't believe she's gone," he murmured softly. That almost broke me. Almost. Because for one dangerous second, he sounded genuine. Like my son again. Like the little boy who used to fall asleep on my chest during thunderstorms. But then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it quickly, and I saw Emily's name on the screen beside 3 words that changed everything. Did he sign? Ryan locked the phone immediately, but not before I saw his expression. Not grief, not sadness, pressure. I pretended not to notice. "Work?" I asked casually. "Yeah," he answered too quickly. "Just work." I nodded slowly. "You should answer her. It can wait." "No," I said. "It sounds important." He stepped into the hallway to take the call. He thought I stayed in the kitchen. I didn't. I moved quietly to the edge of the doorway and listened. "He's resisting," Ryan whispered harshly. "I know, I'm trying, because pushing too hard right now will make him suspicious." Silence. Then, "We need access before January or we're dead." Dead. Interesting word choice. My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. That's something people don't tell you about danger. When it becomes real enough, truly real, panic disappears. Everything becomes cold, focused, clear. Ryan lowered his voice further. "Then maybe Finch can move sooner." Finch. I memorized the name instantly. "No," Ryan continued. "He's still functional enough to fool people." Another silence. Then the sentence that changed the rest of my life. "If we can prove cognitive decline, everything transfers legally." I stepped backward before he returned. By the time he walked into the kitchen again, I was pouring coffee with slightly shaking hands. Performing vulnerability suddenly felt very important. "You okay?" he asked. "Just tired." "You should rest more." "Probably." He studied me carefully, measuring, calculating, seeing weakness where there was finally understanding. After he left, I sat alone at the kitchen table for almost an hour without moving. The house creaked around me. November wind scraped branches against the windows Margaret used to decorate every Christmas. Somewhere upstairs, an old floorboard settled with a pop that sounded almost like footsteps. And slowly, piece by piece, the shape of the truth emerged. They weren't trying to help me. They were hunting me. My own son and his wife had looked at my grief and seen opportunity. Margaret died in February. By April, they were planning how to take everything. The money, the house, control of my life, maybe more. I stared at the unsigned papers still lying on the table. Then I reached for my phone and called the only person I trusted completely. "Daniel?" I said when he answered. Daniel Mercer had been my attorney for 23 years. Former military prosecutor. Quiet man. Dangerous mind. "I need you to come over." He heard something in my voice immediately. "What happened?" I looked toward the dark hallway where my son had stood only minutes earlier. I said carefully, "My family is preparing to bury me before I'm dead." Daniel arrived at my house 43 minutes later, carrying 2 things. A leather briefcase and the expression of a man already expecting bad news. Rain hammered softly against the windows while he removed his coat near the front door. He had turned 60 the previous spring, but he still carried himself like the Marine prosecutor he used to be. Straight back, controlled movements, eyes that never stopped evaluating the room. Margaret trusted him completely. That mattered to me. "You sounded serious," he said. I poured him coffee without answering immediately. My hands looked steady now. Funny how clarity can calm a man faster than comfort ever could. Ryan came by earlier. Daniel accepted the mug. And he brought power of attorney paperwork. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "That alone isn't illegal." "No," I agreed quietly. "But planning to declare me mentally incompetent so he can control my assets probably gets closer." Silence settled between us. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far across the city. Daniel placed the coffee down untouched. "Tell me everything." So I did. Every detail. Emily's pressure. The paperwork. The hallway phone call. The name Finch. The sentence about proving cognitive decline. Daniel interrupted only twice, once to clarify dates and once to ask for exact wording. When I finished, he leaned back slowly in Margaret's old dining chair and exhaled through his nose. Jesus Christ. Hearing another man say it made everything more real. You believe me? I asked. Daniel looked almost offended. Harold, I spent 20 years cross-examining liars for a living. Fear sounds different from paranoia. You're not imagining this. I nodded once, but the relief never came, because confirmation carries its own weight. Part of me had still hoped I was wrong. Daniel folded his hands carefully. Do you know how much debt Ryan has? No, you need to. He opened his briefcase and removed a yellow legal pad. Men usually don't risk crimes like this unless desperation is driving the car. You think he's broke. I think people don't try to seize control of $22 million unless they're drowning somewhere. 22 million. Even now, the number sounded strange in my head. 40 years building Bennett Industrial Systems. 40 years of 14-hour days, canceled vacations, factory expansions, union negotiations, freight disasters, sleepless nights, and coffee that tasted like burnt dirt. Margaret used a joke that I loved warehouses more than people. Truth was, I built the company because I was terrified of failing the family I loved. Then I sold it 3 years ago for enough money that nobody in my bloodline should ever have worried again. Apparently, greed doesn't care how much is enough. What do we do? I asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked toward a living room window. Rainwater streaked down the glass, while headlights passed outside in blurred yellow lines. We build documentation, he said finally, carefully, legally, completely. Meaning if your son is planning fraud, we don't confront him. We let him continue. I stared at him. You want me to pretend I know nothing? Exactly. For how long? He turned back toward me. Until he incriminates himself so thoroughly he can't escape it. Those words hit harder than I expected, because suddenly this wasn't fear anymore. It was war against my own child. Daniel seemed to read that thought on my face. Harold, he said carefully, listen to me. The son you love may still exist somewhere inside him. I genuinely hope that's true. But the man currently making plans around your mental collapse is not safe to underestimate. I sat heavily in my chair. My chest felt hollow. Margaret would have noticed sooner. Probably. He gave a small, sad smile. Your wife was terrifyingly observant. I laughed once to spite myself. She used to say Ryan smiled too quickly whenever he lied. Was she right? I thought about Thanksgiving, about the coffee, about Emily's text message glowing on his phone. Did he sign? Yeah. I whispered. She was right. Daniel returned to the table and opened his notebook. First thing tomorrow, I'm hiring a forensic accounting team. Quietly. We need to know exactly what kind of financial pressure Ryan's under. And Finch. I'll look into him too. He paused. If Ryan's planning an incompetency case, there will be groundwork, doctors, evaluations, paper trails. I rubbed my forehead slowly. I can't believe this is happening. Neither can he. I looked up. What? Daniel's voice lowered. That's important to understand. Men like Ryan convince themselves they're not villains. He's probably already built an entire story in his head where he's rescuing family money, protecting his inheritance, correcting what he thinks he deserves. By drugging me, Daniel held my gaze. You don't know that's part of the plan yet. But something cold inside me already did. 3 days later, Daniel called at 6:10 in the morning. I was awake before the phone rang. Sleep had become shallow lately. Grief already ruins rest. Suspicion finishes the job. I found Finch, Daniel said immediately. And Dr. Leonard Finch, clinical psychologist, licensed currently under ethics review. For what? Manipulating competency evaluations for financial conservatorship cases. My stomach tightened. Meaning wealthy elderly people were declared mentally impaired under questionable circumstances. I closed my eyes. How many? 3 confirmed complaints. Maybe more. Jesus. It gets worse. Daniel's voice hardened. Ryan met with Finch twice in the last month. I stood from the bed slowly. Morning light crept pale and weak through the curtains. Margaret's side of the mattress remained perfectly untouched, just like every morning since February. How do you know? Private investigator. You already hired one? The second you called me. That's why I trusted Daniel. He prepared while other people process emotions. There's another problem, he continued. Ryan's debt situation is catastrophic. I walked downstairs while listening. The old staircase creaked beneath my feet. How bad? Over 1.8 million. I stopped halfway down the stairs. What? Business loans. Gambling losses disguised through shell accounts. Credit lines. Personal leverage against future commissions. Gambling. That explained the desperation. Ryan had always needed the rush of winning. Even as a kid, cards, sports bets, stock trading apps. Margaret once caught him stealing lottery tickets from a gas station when he was 16. I paid the owner quietly and buried the story before it could become public embarrassment. God help me. Maybe that was my first mistake. Emily knows? I asked every dollar of it. Daniel paused briefly. Harold, these people are cornered. That makes them dangerous. People, not family anymore. People. Strange how one word can expose reality. What's the next step? I asked. We document intent. How? By giving them opportunity. I understood immediately. You want me to look vulnerable. Exactly. I walked into the kitchen and stared at Margaret's coffee mug, still hanging beside mine on the rack. I hadn't moved it since she died. I don't know if I can do that, I admitted quietly. Daniel's voice softened slightly. Yes, you can. You sound confident. Because I know something your son forgot. What's that? You didn't build a manufacturing empire by being naive. That almost made me smile. Almost. Over the next 4 weeks, I began performing the role of a declining old man. At first, it disgusted me. Forgetting appointments on purpose. Repeating stories. Pretending confusion over simple paperwork. Leaving television volumes too loud. Asking Ryan to remind me about passwords I absolutely remembered. But gradually, something changed. Ryan became attentive in ways that no longer felt loving. He watched me constantly now, measuring deterioration, tracking weakness like an investor monitoring stock prices. Emily changed too. Her warmth became exaggerated, artificial. She touched my arm during conversations, asked slow, careful questions, spoke to me the way nurses speak to dementia patients. One evening during dinner at their house, I deliberately called Emily by Ryan's ex-girlfriend's name. A tiny mistake. Simple. Human. Emily corrected me gently. Ryan didn't speak for almost 10 seconds afterward because he was too busy hiding excitement. That's when I knew Daniel had been right. They wanted this badly, and desperate people always rush eventually. Then came the first real break. Daniel arrived one Friday evening holding a manila envelope thick with photographs and bank records. His expression told me everything before he even sat down. We got him, he said quietly. Already? Not enough for prosecution yet, but enough to understand the plan. He spread documents across my dining table. Casino withdrawals, offshore transfers, debt notices, emails. One printed message sat at the center like a loaded gun. From Emily Carter Bennett to Ryan Bennett subject. Thanksgiving, he'll be emotional without her there. Easier to manage. If Finch signs off before year end, we survive. I stared at the words until they blurred slightly. Margaret hadn't even been dead a full year when they wrote that. Daniel placed another paper beside it. Draft guardianship petition. Preliminary cognitive decline concerns. Recommendation for emergency financial oversight. My name sat at the top like I was already halfway buried. They were planning to file this after Thanksgiving, Daniel said. Why Thanksgiving? Because they expected you to deteriorate publicly around family witnesses. Then he hesitated. Just briefly. There's something else. I looked up slowly. What? Daniel's eyes locked onto mine. Finch recently prescribed heavy sedatives connected to another conservatorship case. Silence. You think they're planning to drug me? I think Daniel said carefully, "You need to stop drinking anything handed to you by your son." And suddenly, like lightning illuminating a landscape in darkness, the future became horrifyingly clear. Thanksgiving wasn't going to be a family dinner. It was going to be an execution dressed like concern. Thanksgiving arrived cold and gray, the kind of November morning Margaret used to love, because it made the whole house smell warmer once the oven turned on. By 8 o'clock, I was already awake in the kitchen wearing the navy sweater. She bought me 11 Christmases earlier, the one with a tiny tear near the wrist she always threatened to sew and never did. Funny the things grief preserves. Not the grand moments. Not anniversaries or speeches. Tiny unfinished details. Daniel arrived at 9, carrying 2 paper bags of pastries, and the expression of a man walking into court before a verdict. "Everything's set," he said quietly after checking security monitors installed throughout the first floor. Tiny cameras hidden in smoke detectors. Motion-sensitive audio recorders. Legally documented. Time-stamped. Every hallway. Every doorway. Every angle of the kitchen. The investigators. I asked, parked 2 houses down. "Police?" Waiting for my call. I nodded once. My stomach felt strangely calm. That frightened me more than panic would have. Daniel studied my face carefully. "You still have time to stop this." I looked toward Margaret's empty chair near the window. "No," I said softly. "I really don't." Ryan and Emily arrived at 12:17 with their 2 daughters and 3 bottles of wine. Nobody planned to drink. Emily hugged me too tightly at the door. "Happy Thanksgiving, Harold," she said with careful warmth. Harold, not Dad anymore. Interesting. Ryan carried pumpkin pies into the kitchen, while smiling the same easy smile that used to charm teachers, girlfriends, clients, strangers. Margaret always called it his campaign smile. "House smells great," he said casually. "Catering company deserved the credit." I answered. I only plated everything. Still counts. But his eyes were already moving around the room, checking things, measuring things, hunting opportunity. My younger sister Claire arrived 20 minutes later with her husband Michael. Unlike everyone else in the house, they knew absolutely nothing about what was coming. Daniel insisted on that. "Real witnesses are more valuable than prepared ones," he told me earlier that week. He was right. Claire hugged me so hard my ribs hurt. "You doing okay?" she whispered gently. I almost broke right there, because unlike everyone else asking me that question lately, she actually meant it. Some days, I answered honestly. Dinner started at 2. Turkey, sweet potatoes. Green bean casserole Margaret's recipe card still described as idiot-proof. Ryan laughed louder than necessary at Michael's stories. Emily played perfect hostess. The girls chased each other to the hallway, while Christmas music drifted softly from the living room speakers. To anyone outside that house, it looked like family. That's the terrifying thing about betrayal. Sometimes it sits directly across from you, wearing a warm smile, while passing the cranberry sauce. Halfway through dinner, I started performance. I repeated a story about an old fishing trip. Forgot Michael's dog had died last spring. Asked Claire twice what month we were in. Tiny fractures. Small enough to seem believable. Ryan watched every mistake like a starving man watching food. Emily barely touched her wine because she was too busy studying me, evaluating me, waiting. Then came coffee. "I'll help you carry everything," Ryan offered immediately. Of course he did. Daniel glanced at me once across the table. Barely noticeable. "Ready?" We walked together into the kitchen. I opened cabinets slowly, pretending stiffness in my hands. Ryan stood beside the coffee tray arranging cups while I reached for spoons. Then I heard it. A tiny sound. Plastic opening. Small. Sharp. Deliberate. My heartbeat slowed instantly. Not faster. Slower. I turned slightly without fully facing him. Ryan's back was toward me. One hand moved quickly near my cup. Then gone. "You okay, Dad?" he asked casually without turning around. "Fine," I answered. My voice sounded terrifyingly normal. "Just tired. Long day." "Yeah." He placed the cups onto the tray himself. Helpful son. Caring son. Future executioner. We walked back into the dining room together. I set desserts down carefully while Ryan distributed coffee. My cup landed near my right hand. Steam curled upward gently, innocent looking. That was the worst part. Evil rarely announces itself dramatically. Most of the time it looks ordinary. Then fate intervened. Or maybe God. Or Margaret. To this day, I honestly don't know. Claire asked me a question about the old lake house, while everyone reached for sugar and cream. During the distraction, Emily absent-mindedly picked up the nearest coffee cup beside her plate. Mine. She took a long drink, while Ryan looked directly at me waiting. 3 seconds passed before realization hit him. I watched the exact instant terror enter my son's face. "Emily," he started suddenly. "Too late." "What?" she asked, confused. Ryan stood halfway from his chair. "Don't drink that." Silence slammed across the room instantly. Emily frowned. "Why?" Ryan froze. Because there was no answer he could give that wouldn't destroy him. Every eye at the table turned toward him. Claire looked confused. Michael stopped moving entirely. Even the girls went quiet in the hallway. "Ryan," Emily asked again, slower this time. Her hand tightened slightly around the mug. Then she blinked hard. Once. Twice. She stopped talking. Ryan went pale so fast it looked like somebody drained the blood directly from his body. "Emily?" Her hand slipped against the table. Coffee spilled across the tablecloth Margaret bought 20 years earlier in Vermont. "I don't feel right," she whispered. And suddenly chaos detonated. Claire rushed around the table. Michael grabbed his phone. One of the girls started crying in the hallway. Emily tried standing but collapsed sideways into Ryan's arms instead. "Call 911. Michael shouted. Ryan didn't move. He just stared at the cup like it was a loaded gun that had fired the wrong direction. "Ryan!" I barked. That snapped him awake. His hands shook violently while dialing. Emily's breathing became shallow. Slurred words. Heavy eyelids. Sedation hitting fast. Not enough to kill, but enough to incapacitate. Enough to make an old grieving widower appear dangerously unstable after Thanksgiving dinner. Daniel stepped from the hallway at exactly the right moment. "Calm. Controlled. Ambulance is already coming," he announced firmly. Ryan's eyes snapped toward him in pure horror, because suddenly he understood. This had never been his trap. It was mine. Paramedics arrived within 9 minutes. Police within 12. By then, Emily could barely stay conscious. The lead paramedic asked what she consumed. Nobody answered immediately. Then Ryan made the mistake that destroyed everything. It was supposed to be his cup. Silence. Complete silence. Even Emily looked at him through half-conscious eyes with confusion, turning slowly into fear. Ryan realized what he'd said 1 second too late. Detective Laura Mendez entered the dining room moments later, while officers separated everyone for statements. Mid-40s. Sharp-eyed. No patience for nonsense. Daniel handed her a folder thick with evidence before she even asked questions. Surveillance stills. Financial records. Email printouts. Audio transcripts. Legally obtained. Perfectly organized. "You've been investigating your own son?" she asked me quietly. "I've been protecting myself from him," I answered. Ryan sat in the living room while officers questioned him. He looked smaller somehow. Deflated. Like the performance finally cost more energy than he had left to maintain. I walked in after Detective Mendez finished. He stared at me with wet eyes I almost recognized. Almost. "Dad." His voice cracked apart. "How long?" "Since the phone call in your hallway." He closed his eyes. "I didn't want to hurt you." Strange sentence. Men always say that after aiming directly at your heart. "You drugged my coffee," I said quietly. "It wasn't supposed to be dangerous." "No." My voice stayed calm. "What happens after I appear confused in front of witnesses? After Finch declares cognitive decline? After you gain legal control of my money?" He looked away because cowardice always avoids eye contact once masks fall off. "We were drowning," he whispered. "Emily said if we could just get control temporarily. So you bury me early." "Dad, please." No, that word stopped him cold. I stood there looking at the boy Margaret once rocked to sleep during thunderstorms. The teenager I taught to drive. The man I believed would carry our family forward after I was gone. And suddenly I understood something terrible. Love does not guarantee safety. Sometimes the people who know how to hurt you best are the people you taught where to aim. Your mother spent her entire life loving you, I said quietly, and this is what you became anyway. Ryan started crying then. Real crying. Ugly crying. But consequences do not disappear just because regret finally arrives late to the funeral. Emily survived. Toxicology confirmed heavy sedatives in the coffee. Finch cooperated within 48 hours after detectives threatened conspiracy charges. Ryan and Emily were both arrested before Christmas. Fraud. Conspiracy. Attempted aggravated poisoning. Financial exploitation. The trial lasted 6 months. Neither of them looked at me once during sentencing. Ryan received 11 years. Emily got 7. Finch lost his medical license permanently and avoided prison only by surrendering evidence against other fraudulent conservatorship schemes. Claire didn't speak to me for almost 3 weeks afterward. Not because I was wrong. Because truth hurts everyone standing nearby when it explodes. I just can't understand how family becomes this, she whispered during our first phone call after the trial. Neither can I. Maybe I never will. The house stayed unbearably quiet after that winter. Grief returned differently this time. Heavier, more complicated. I lost my wife first, then my son while he was still alive. Some nights that distinction didn't feel important. But life keeps moving even when you wish it wouldn't. Daniel helped restructure my estate completely. Safer now. Harder to manipulate. I started volunteering twice a week with an elder fraud legal network downtown. Mostly paperwork. Phone calls. Frightened old people realizing too late that love can become leverage in the wrong hands. I understood them immediately. Last month, a widower named Frank sat across from me clutching documents with shaking fingers while explaining how his niece emptied his retirement account. Halfway through the story, he stopped speaking and asked quietly, "How do you survive something like this?" I thought about Margaret, about Thanksgiving, about poisoned coffee and broken bloodlines, and the terrible cost of finally seeing someone clearly. Then I told him the only honest thing I know. You survive by refusing to let betrayal turn you into the same kind of monster that caused it. My name is Harold Bennett. I am 67 years old. Last Thanksgiving, my son tried to steal my life while pretending to save it. He failed because he forgot something important. Old men who spend decades building empires do not become helpless overnight. We notice more than people think. We remember more than they expect. And sometimes, while everyone else is busy preparing the trap, we are quietly building one of our own.